What's up? What's up? What's up, y'all? You are listening to the Data is My Science podcast, the show that makes data your passion with your host, Dapper Data, as usual. So, the past podcast, if you've been listening, right, if you have been listening to each one of the podcasts that I've done, probably for the past 6 months or so, I have not had a person I'm actually interviewing on the podcast. And I've just been talking and rambling and rambling. And I know you all are probably tired of hearing my voice, right? I talk about different subjects, fun, technical, whatever it is, but that's okay. And so I decided, I said, hey, look, let me bring on somebody onto this podcast that is an expert in one of the subjects that I continuously talk about. And I wanted to bring on Keith McCormick. Okay. This person right here, I mean, he is an amazing, amazing data science coach, machine learning coach, LinkedIn learning trainer, author, and speaker. When you think about data science, you think Keith. Okay. So his focus for many years has been around statistics and SPSS, but he also has some knowledge in data mining, machine learning, predictive analytics, you name it. He's co-authored 6 books. He's also actually created 12 courses. So without further introduction, I want to introduce you all to Keith McCormick. All right. Hey, Keith, tell them a little bit about yourself, where you're from, how you got into the industry.
Sure. And thanks for having me. I've been looking forward to this. So the period that, is probably the most interesting for our talk today is when I started doing the SPSS stuff, but a little quick bio before that. So grew up in Rhode Island, did undergrad in Massachusetts, and I moved to North Carolina where I still live because I was thinking about doing PhD work. In fact, it doesn't come up in conversation all that often. Since I was interested in statistics and psychology, I was thinking psychometrics.
Oh,
So, like personality tests and standardized tests and all that kind of stuff. Long story on how I got involved in that. But anyway, I relocated to establish state residency down in North Carolina because Chapel Hill had a really good program in what I wanted to do. And of course, I had to pay the bills too, right? It takes a couple of years to establish residency. So I was doing a research job, just working from the house here. I was in the same house years ago. And needed to learn some SPSS. I'd already been using it for quite a few years, but I talked to my boss at the time and I said, hey, if you'll pay the training fee and I take care of the expenses, like the travel, any cities that I might have to go to, and if I don't fall behind my work, if I promise, it was only a part-time role, if I stay on top of my work and I do all those things, is that like a fair trade? And of course, my boss figured, he's going to pick up the travel expense, don't have to worry about that. It was just a flat fee. So that happened. So long story short, I spent a summer really up in DC. I waited until, you get all those college kids leave town and rented a little room up there. And I took every SPSS class they had, and I'd already been using it for 5 or 6 years, but I squeezed every nickel out of that flat rate. It was a very cool thing. They had what they call the training subscription. So you paid, for me out of pocket, it would have been a fair amount of money, but for my boss, it was a great deal. It was maybe $2 or $3 grand. Nothing like it exists now, and it would be more now. And these were live classes. But think about it. Then I'm interacting with 8 or 10 different instructors. They're all amazing, PhDs, all kinds of different disciplines. And just some of the classes I would take more than once because the subscription let you do that. And I just camped out, and I just worked from there.
So that's interesting because a lot of people don't understand how important it is to take advantage of the opportunities that are presented to you. And that's exactly what you did, right? You just ran with it.
Yeah, it was all in, and to use the poker metaphor. Yeah, because I figured, well, it's crazy not to. There was no way my boss was going to pay this another calendar year. So now I was still planning on grad school because, well, we were talking about this earlier. What's more important to someone when they're getting ready to do their dissertation work than stats?
Yeah.
And not just the stats PhDs, everybody. So it was crazy of me not to leverage that opportunity to the fullest. But what happened was I really kind of caught the bug of this whole environment of the software training. One of the reasons that I want to be a PhD is I figured, I'd have a nice house and walk to campus and, be an
Mhm.
academic. I guess I was kind of in love with that whole image of what, we kind of think being a professor is. I just thought that would be
Yeah.
really cool. And then I was thinking, well, the software trainer thing is kind of interesting too. I mean, these trainers, they'll teach for a week in DC and then they teach for a week in Chicago, you
Mhm.
know? And I was in my late 20s. I was just shy of 30 at the time. And I thought, well, this kind of combination of business travel and I get the teaching. So I just became very intrigued.
Mhm.
So they needed someone to teach the basic course. And of course, I was taking these kind of advanced courses, like even some stuff that people don't associate with SPSS, like their coding courses and stuff. And
Mhm.
they said, we keep on finding these business folks that don't slow down to cover the theory well enough. And then we bring in these retired professors
Mhm.
who don't teach it applied enough. Said
Mhm.
the guy was frustrated because he had like 20, 30 interviews and he wasn't happy with anybody. But then opportunity strikes again, said, how would you feel about doing this? And again, I'd spent weeks hanging out with these folks. I just thought they were a great bunch of people. So I did that instead of grad school. And I did that for 10 years. I mean,
Yeah,
like nonstop for 10 years. Thousands of people, hundreds and hundreds of teaching days
man, and
all over the US.
what's your another nugget that I just took from that or gem is that you what you've been able to do is mix theory with practice. Throughout that time at such an early stage in your life because a lot of people don't understand how important that is, right? I mean, some people, you got the PhDs who just go all theory, right? And then you have the people who are going all practice, right? They're hands on like crazy, but they don't have the theory. They're not forward thinking, they're not thought leaders. And if you can blend the two, right, is what you have done, at an early age, that's key. That's so key right there, you know.
Yep. No, that's so true. And I really thought that there would be this glass ceiling above me that without the PhD, I wasn't going to be able to do serious work in that area
Mm-hmm.
because almost all my colleagues had a PhD. But again, I started out teaching, even though I had several years of experience, I was limited to the courses that I felt and they felt I should be teaching. But
Mm-hmm.
then, the years start to melt away. Next thing you know, I've been doing this 4 or 5 years and they'll say, hey, I remember one of the courses that was a tough prep for me was the time series econometrics course. I mean,
Oh
that's
man.
that's kind of intense
That's
stuff, right? But after 3 or 4 years of teaching this stuff every day,
Mhm.
I said, I think I'm ready. Let me sit in one more time because I had taken it, years before. But
Mhm.
that was the kind of thing you can imagine. I was up all night,
Oh
reading
man.
like the next day, double checking. That was really intense material. But again, 3, 4 years of every day teaching this stuff, I was absorbing a lot of stuff and I eventually was ready. And then, once that kind of started, I got more and more brave. So, the environment is kind of hard to explain in the sense that no one would do it this way anymore with the online options that we have. And this
Mhm.
was in the late 90s. I'm in an early 50s. I'm not like an 80-year-old man,
Mhm.
this wasn't that long ago, but the landscape has completely and utterly changed because there were 30 or more short courses. And when I mean a short course, I don't mean an hour. I mean, they were 2 or 3 days.
Oh.
So we're talking about 50 or 60 business days of material.
Mhm.
So even if you took class every day for 10 weeks, you still weren't covering all of it because you got 3 days on just regression, you have 2 days on just analysis of variance, you
Yeah.
have 3 days on just econometrics, you have 2 days on just marketing segmentation. So it was a powerful experience. So looking back, um, I would have felt like a jerk if I phrased it this way back then because I didn't have an advanced degree and I was somewhat sensitive to the fact that I didn't because I thought again that would be job opportunities that where I just wouldn't be a candidate. But
Mhm.
looking back after, 10,000 or 20,000 hours, literally, in that
Mhm.
classroom environment, I definitely got the equivalent of a master's,
Yeah,
in
definitely.
stuff by just soaking up the same oxygen as, all of my colleagues. And they were just absolutely top notch folks.
Yeah, because they say that it takes about 10,000 hours to really know what you're trying to accomplish or what you're trying to know, to be that expert in it, and you have to spend that amount of time, and you've been able to do it in a more of a structured environment, which was good, because instead of you having to, go on your own and try to figure out what should I study? Should I study this? Should I study that? Who should I talk to? It was right there for you, and you just took it, took advantage of it, and that's key. And
Absolutely.
that actually is something that I took some notes on just then because
Yeah.
so many people try to spread themselves thin and try to understand so many different things within data science, right? Like you got SPSS, you got R, you got all these different programming languages you learn. You can do statistics. You can, like, instead of just focusing in on something and being great at it. Seems like it's a better route to go, and then you'll learn other things along the way as well.
Well, it was a powerful experience. It really was. And I remember when Malcolm Gladwell's Outliers, the famous 10,000
Yeah.
hours, has been around
Mhm.
for a while, but he's the one that made it famous. And, there's another saying that's relevant here of you don't really know it until you try to teach it, kind of a thing.
Mhm.
So through that experience, after about 8 or 9 years, it took that long, because I remember when the Gladwell book came out and everybody was talking about the 10,000 hours.
Mhm.
That, just about a decade into my training career, I had exceeded 10,000 teaching hours.
Oh.
So that would have been on top of the 5 or 6 years of experience I had before I got the gig, and then that story of the summer that I spent, taking every class I could, you know. Um, so then that's when it really sunk in. So, there are courses, because everybody had their favorites. So the regression course was one of my favorites,
Mhm.
and I don't know how many thousands of people I taught that 3-day course to, but it was thousands. And
Yeah.
that face-to-face in the classroom, taking their questions, having lunch with them and stuff like that, that's an
Mhm.
intense experience. So, um, looking back, I think they were kind of fortunate, the attendees, and I was attendees in some of this too, because it was a really immersive, powerful experience. But boy, I learned so much too. You'd figure you teach it 10 times, there's nothing left to lose. Oh, funny experience. I remember, um, I'm sure, I bet you've heard the name John Tukey, the famous, he
Oh,
died.
yeah, 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 yeah.
So check this out. This is really remarkable.
Uh-huh.
So it's about what the second year of my training career. So I was starting to teach more middle level courses. I don't think I was teaching the econometrics course at that point, but I was definitely teaching the regression course.
Mhm.
And I was feeling pretty confident, but you never know. You'll have an experience where you doubt. Even if you've taught it a dozen times, you kind of start to, you'll have this experience that makes you doubt things.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
this guy came up to me during the break and said, Keith, I'm enjoying your class. I was John Tukey's grad student at Princeton.
Oh, man.
And this guy
Nice.
in my class, you know. But anyway, what we talked about was similar to what came up before, is that you can be too applied, you can be too
Mhm.
theoretical, or you can strike it right down the middle. And that was the compliment that he gave me. And that really gave me a tremendous amount of confidence, because you can imagine the brief panic when this guy walks up and introduced himself in the way that he did. I mean, he was an older guy at the time, as you can imagine, because when would Tukey have been taking on grad students? In the 70s or
Yeah,
something?
yeah,
You know?
yeah.
And
No,
this
that's awesome.
was in the
Oh, man,
late
I didn't
90s.
know
That was
that about
so to get a compliment from them was, I was relieved it wasn't the reverse. Can you imagine if I would have been
Oh,
shattered
man. Yeah,
if he
you'd have been, your career would have been over.
I wouldn't have been able to get out of bed the next morning. Yeah.
Yeah. So one of the things, when looking at your story, and your focus in on SPSS, right? I mean, just recently, I literally, right before we got on this podcast, I was looking at a social media post, right, from a friend that I know in the UK, and they were saying, "Hey, what's the difference between R and SPSS, right?" That's all they do, right? That's everybody that I follow on social media, right? That's involved with SPSS or R. They're always competing or comparing the two. And what I've kind of learned, and I'm able to speak more on R, but from an SPSS standpoint, I'm learning more and more because as we talked a little bit before, I'm actually in my quantitative research course that I have right now. That's one of the tools that they said they want us to use. Right, that was one of like three or four, and because we already started using SPSS, I said, hey, look, I'm just going to use that. You have the free subscription through my program and all that good stuff. But the more and more I research it, I understand that R and SPSS are two industry leading technologies for for statistics, right? For statistical data analysis. So I get it. And I'm actually starting to realize that SPSS is probably the it seems like R is the preferred option for an object-oriented programmer, right? Or somebody that just only that does programming. They come from that programming background. But from an industry standpoint, I actually would recommend now SPSS, and so I don't know your thoughts on it. I know you said you had a little bit of R, you had more SPSS, of course, being in the community. But do you see that there's this competitive nature? And then outside of that, what do you see as some of the great benefits of SPSS versus R?
Well, it's a big topic, and the part of R that I like the most is ggplot2, which some people will have heard of. So I'll comment more on that in a minute. But I want to briefly talk about something that a lot of folks listening might not be familiar with, and that is when Windows 95 came out. That's really when SPSS, as like a Windows-based graphical user interface, really took off. It had been doing that beforehand, but that's when you started to have people like pouring into classes, like the classes that I would describe. I started training the winter of 97, 98, so not long after this. And, we'd even have people in class that were kind of getting used to a mouse and everything. I mean, it was just a very different time than it is now. It's kind of hard to remember. But the reason I bring this up is at the time, there was a little bit of this civil war going on within the SPSS community between SPSS users that used only the menus and SPSS users that were coders. And that's the part that people forget about, right, is that SPSS came out in 68. There was no Windows. There was no Mac in 68. Happens to be my birth year, actually. So I always remember without thinking how old SPSS is. It came out a long time ago, more than 50 years ago. So, and the reason there was a bit of a civil war going on between these two groups is that the coders within the SPSS community said, oh, they're using it as a crutch. They're taking like a shortcut. They must not know what they're doing, because they need the menu. They need this extra help. And I think, because I lived through that, and that went on for years, and people would be passionate about it, and you could tell, like the coders and the graphical user interface folks literally wouldn't have lunch together.
Oh man, it was that bad.
Once they introduced each other, and they kind of got the vibe from each other and stuff, right? They wouldn't have known that when they walked in because you can't see it, But they would get talking and say, oh, yeah, I relate so much more to this other coder, or I relate so much. There was definitely tension there. And there was definitely the feeling of, the coders are like in the weeds. And, so I've been through this before is my point. So, and that's what the way that coders will sometimes describe people that use a graphical user interface is, oh, they must be incompetent, because they need some kind of a crutch, So, so that experience informs, the way that I think about it, because I've seen people get into little silly fights over this. So here's my 2 cents on it. Okay. The machine learning person in me appreciates the fact that you need to have some coding skills or a coder's mentality to deploy a model. And I'm passionate about that. I definitely think that you can't get return on investment. In fact, you mentioned LinkedIn Learning. One of the courses I'm going to do this year is a course specifically on return on investment in predictive analytics. That's the topic of the whole course.
Oh,
it's how to make sure you ROI in predictive analytics. I'm really excited.
That's what they want from a business standpoint. That's what they want,
Well, it's funny how it happened because I had one lecture on it. It was, just 2 or 3 minutes. You know how these video things are. You got to kind of keep it
Mhm.
moving. So I had just 3 minutes on this, and somebody put in the comments said, "I love this course. I especially love this lecture. You could do a whole course on it."
Mhm.
I was blown away by that comment because I said that's true, and I couldn't help myself. I started grabbed a piece of paper and I outlined if I did have like an hour and 15 minutes, what I would say,
Right.
and I proposed it, and they're going to do it. So that side of me, I want to be business oriented. I want to be applied. I want to achieve return on investment. I totally get why coding is important. However, there's two distinct mission statements when you're doing um, data science type stuff. Okay. And that is sometimes the whole purpose of the project is to deploy a model. But as you know, sometimes more like dissertation work, sometimes what you're doing is not a deployed model, but a report of some kind.
Hmm.
So think about all the folks that I used to see in my classes in Arlington, Virginia, in the DC office, obviously with a government spin, very much a government spin on it. Somebody that would work at, the Department of Labor. I remember that I had a CIA guy in class, and it sounds funny, like he wasn't a spy, he wasn't a stereotypical CIA. A lot of folks will be familiar with, particularly international travelers, will be familiar with the CIA fact books.
Hmm.
It's the population of the country, it's the
Yeah.
demographic breakdown, all those kinds of things.
Graphic stuff. Yeah.
It's fantastic to have those CIA fact books around. And he was on that staff. He would write the CIA fact book. So he didn't have to conceal, he actually had like CIA on his business card, in other words, which most people
Hmm.
don't. Usually they
Yeah. They're
have their
incognito.
big
They're
job.
hiding. Yeah.
So somebody like that, or somebody that would be at the Department of Labor, or all these various things, right? A lot
Mhm.
of people are doing analyses so they can put out some kind of annual statistical report or something like that, right?
Right. Right.
Why? Now, here's where the coders would come in. They would say, "Oh, but I don't care if it's a report or not. You need to have a paper trail of how you got there." And I understand that logic too. But
Mhm.
that concern is built around a myth that if someone's using a graphical user interface, that there's no paper trail. They're thinking more of something like Excel. And I'm not trying to slam Excel here, but Excel, what's your deliverable, is the spreadsheet itself. There's
Exactly.
really
Yeah.
no log unless you're doing macros or something. There's no way that you get the next month's data and everything's automatic unless you're an Excel power user and you're doing macro kind of stuff. But
Hmm.
that paper trail is inherent to SPSS. Folks that only have passing familiarity with it, maybe they've heard the name but never used it, perhaps don't know that right next to the OK button, there's always a paste button. And what that does is turns all of your clicks into code
Hmm.
and sends
Hmm.
it to a log file where you can reproduce the work and where you can show the work to another human as well and say, here's how I got there step by step. So this I have to code because I have to document. That's built around a myth.
Yeah.
The good stats packages leave that paper trail. So if you're going to say that you have to deploy the model, frankly, that issue is a bit of mythology too, because
Yeah.
SPSS could do that quite readily. But that's where someone's really got my attention. If I say, hey, I'm not just building this model to learn something. I'm building this model to put it into production.
Yeah.
That's where I'm more won over on the coding argument and its benefits.
Yeah.
But if they're, one of these folks at the Department of Labor and they're trying to crunch some numbers to include in a report, I just don't see any reason why they have to be, a coder, right? Particularly if there's that paper trail, which there is.
Yeah, and you make an amazing point. Several points, but the no code. We talked about it, right? A lot of tools that are coming out now, and they're removing that you must code. A feature from there. They're really focusing in on trying to. I mean, what's the ultimate goal? The ultimate goal is bringing value to the customer, and you want to be able to have the. I mean, well, from a coder's perspective, depending on what their goal is, they may have underlying goals, outside of it, but mostly when you're working in an enterprise environment or you're working for an organization, at the end of the day, the C-level execs, right? They don't care how you derive this and what you did. I mean, bring me some business value, and so that I can make the decision at the end of the day. I don't care about all the stuff in the background that you're doing, right? Even though we care about it, right? Because we're putting in all these hours and things like that. But if you could get to that same end goal, and you could remove the coder part. Maybe it's the fact that, or maybe they're feeling like they're threatened, right? The coder side of things is a threat. When you're losing that aspect, they're losing their job. Do you think that that's something that plays a part?
I encountered that on a gig once. It was a tense gig. It wasn't a lot of fun, because what it was is they had one coder. Now again, this is people associate coding with R and Python, but you have SPSS and SAS coders too. On this particular gig that got a little tense, it was a SAS coder. And what they were doing is they wanted me to come in to teach everybody how to use SPSS in the menus. Because they said what's happened is we're crippled when this employee is out sick or something. And we live in fear, that she would leave the company or something like that, right? Because the code wasn't terribly well documented, right? And the team lead felt a prisoner of this employee's code. We don't understand it, we can't reproduce it. And of course, this isn't a praiseworthy thing to purposely make your code that way, right? Obviously, somebody can write good SAS code, but there was a certain motivation, I think, to purposely make this SAS code hard to read. And she explicitly said that. She said, if you all learn how to do this, what happens to me?
Right. I feel like the job.
Recognizing the sleepless nights, that her boss was going through. I mean, you're on a team because you should be, working together. So yeah, I think there's some of that, certainly. But let me revisit it from a different angle, which is, why can the menus sometimes be a really big help? Well, something that I think sometimes we forget about coding, and again, I've already said what I like about the coding, which is when you go to put stuff into production, that's going to be an important thing to do. But you can generate the code from the menus, as I've explained, and there's something out about the menus that I find very powerful. Coders that are being honest will admit the following, and that is, you can write really stripped down, streamlined code that's sometimes just a couple of lines, and you get your model or you get your report, but it's really just stripped down, and it's really just a few words. So it's not like coding is incredibly difficult, and a lot of times people are frankly just copying and pasting. Whatever. They don't even know, what your own stuff. but here's where I get a little freaked out, because I remember those thousands of hours I spent walking people through the menus. Is that if you're looking at the screen and you see 20 options, checkboxes, drop-down menus, and so on, and there's one that you don't understand, you might not deal with it right away, but that is going to haunt you. You're going to wonder, what is that button that I don't understand? And eventually you're going to look the darn thing up, okay? But when the code is stripped down like that, you can't see those options, because what you're basically doing is you're telling the computer is, I want to predict this variable with those variables, but otherwise give me nothing but defaults. You're not really making a conscious decision of what you want. You're basically just going for, give me the package deal. It'd be like going to buy a car, and they tell you about all the different, complicated options packages they have, but they say, hey, if you want the car this week, you're going to have to go with a standard package, because everything else is a special order. And you say, oh, I want the car right away, so I'll go with a standard package. That's basically what's happening when you write 2 lines of code. You're saying, give me, I don't know what I'm getting, but just give me the standard package, right? No one brings that up. And I think it's unfortunate, because again, I've been through this feud between these two groups where the coders were forever telling the folks that use the menus that they were incompetent. Because if they were serious about this as a career, they'd go out and learn some code. And I used to get so impatient with that argument, not because I didn't recognize the value of the code, but because I thought it was an unfair critique. The folks that are using the menus have to learn their stuff. So that brings us to today. So I've seen this going on for years. But now we're having the fight all over again in this argument for low code or no code or AutoML. That's a little bit different, because that's more like what the coders were accusing the menu users of the 90s of doing, which is, hey, I just press the button and it's like magic. I just press the magic button and I get the result.
Right.
I don't think that's a fair characterization of what we were. I mean, why would we have had 50 or 60 days of training if that's all we were doing, just pressing the magic button?
Right.
But sometimes I think these days people are proposing that you get the easy button.
Yeah.
And
Oh,
then we
definitely.
get into the future of work issues, that
Right.
I know that we'll talk about eventually as well, right? So I think that's an unfair critique of what menus used to be, but I don't know if it's an unfair critique of what menus will become. If it's a wizard and if it's using AI behind the scenes to make the decisions for you,
Hmm.
almost like autocomplete when you're typing.
Hmm.
Emails, sometimes you type
Yeah.
like two words and
Emails
it
doing
finishes a sentence.
it.
And usually I don't want the sentence it gives me, but still it's impressive.
Yeah.
And when machine learning gets to that stage, now we've got to watch out, because if the menus are a wizard, that's very different than what I was describing, whereas the human is selecting the options they want and the options are in front of them where they can see it, and they're making sometimes some subtle and tough decisions about what they want. Yeah.
Yeah, because you're right. They actually have to understand the decisions that they're making, and not just click, click, click. And now that you broke it down like that, actually have a totally different, perspective and respect for SPSS and the menu driven aspect of things. I mean, think about it. Even in going back to Windows, right? They compare Windows versus Linux. They're like, I like the Linux, I like the command line, but then Windows, you have to know what you're doing if you're really good at what you're doing with Windows, right? And so you should not shoot down uh, somebody else's method or the other tool just because you may be more familiar with yours, and so what you just pointed out was, that was really good. Yeah, that was really good because really understanding every bit of the menu. You're right. It's like I don't know if you read the book. It's a book called The Nudge Theory, and with that book, it's kind of like nudging you, just saying, hey, look, like for me, I feel like that looking at the menu, to drop down menus, and realizing that it's a pain because you're skipping past this and you're not understanding what it really means, because it could actually benefit you and what you're trying to do. I would love to. I know for me, I would continue to look that up and try to figure out what that is. After a while, because it's nudging me. It's like right there, saying, "Look, you keep passing me. Maybe that's why, your day, your results are coming out this way."
I hadn't heard of that book, but nudge is exactly the word, because there'll be a little checkbox, when you do regression, for instance, that says VIF. It's kind of like, if you want VIF, check this box. And you go, well, what the heck is VIF? And then you look it up and you realize that VIF is variance inflation factor. And you go,
Mm-hmm.
well, what the heck is variance inflation factor,
Mm-hmm.
right? And then you realize that it's connected to multicollinearity.
Mm-hmm.
And then you go, oh, well, I've heard that word, but what does VIF have to do
Yeah.
with that? Next thing you know, 2 hours have melted away, and you just learned something really important about
Right.
checking for the presence of multicollinearity in your regression. And I
Right.
don't think, well, I mean, all the R users, that are listening can kind of just do a self-check. Are you familiar with Durbin-Watson,
Mm-hmm.
tolerance, VIF? Have
Yeah.
they ever come up in conversation?
No.
For some listening, I'm sure the answer might be yes, but for a bunch, I bet the answer is no.
Yeah.
And there's been nothing about that process of learning those commands and generating those results that has nudged them. I'm going to borrow that
Mm-hmm.
word because it's so perfect. That's nudged them to look this stuff up. So they might go 5 years without looking it up.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That's absolutely true, and I know that would be me. You may, by the end of this, you may switch me over to be an SPSS focused individual.